Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hi, I'm Frances Hayes, Director of Communications and Public Relations, and your host for this episode of the Water for Food podcast. Today, I'm joined by my colleague at the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute and our Director of Research, Dr. Christopher Neale. Dr. Neale joined DWFI in 2013 and oversees our research efforts, engaging faculty in new projects and initiating partnerships all over the world with various organizations, universities, and industry partners. Throughout his decades-long career, his research has focused primarily on developing remote sensing applications for irrigated agriculture, hydrology, and natural resources monitoring. He has developed a low-cost airborne remote sensing system used in the western U.S. to map the energy balance and evapotranspiration of plants. For our listeners who may not be familiar with the term, remote sensing is a way of obtaining information about objects or surfaces from a distance without the need to make physical contact, usually by measuring reflected or emitted radiation. This data is typically gathered through the use of sensors on aircraft, drones, or satellites and can be very helpful with lots of different fields. This includes agriculture. Dr. Neale is a founding partner and executive committee member of the Irrigation Innovation Consortium and has led numerous national and international partnerships and projects to improve irrigation management in the U.S., Middle East and North Africa, India, Brazil, and Kazakhstan. This year, the American Society of Civil Engineers honored him with the Royce J. Tipton Award for significant contributions on the use of remote sensing for estimating evapotranspiration of agricultural crops, irrigation water management and hydrology, and the education of irrigation engineers. Christopher, I'm really excited to talk to you today about your work and what it might mean for the future of agriculture.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
So I always like to start us off with the story of how you got here. So tell us about where you grew up, your early career experiences, and what made you interested in remote sensing and how it relates to agriculture and natural resources.
I'll try and make a short version of the story. I was born and raised in Brazil, British parents. My mother was born in Brazil as well. And so that's how I came up with an English name. And I studied civil engineering in Brazil, and at the end of that 5-year degree, I wanted and had always been attracted to do something related to agriculture, and irrigation seemed to be the way to go. So I came to the U.S. to do a master's in agricultural engineering with an irrigation focus. So that's how I initially got into the irrigation field. And during my MS at Colorado State, my advisor was interested in remote sensing and sort of nudged me in that direction. And so that's how I ended up diving into this the technology, which at the time was in the beginning. This was in the early 80s, and the first Landsat satellite was launched in 74. So it was in the early days of satellite remote sensing. And at that time we were working with field radiometers to measure the reflectance and thermal infrared radiometers to measure the temperature of the crop. So a lot of the work was done in the field on the ground with those. And so that's how it all got started, and then eventually I stayed on for a doctorate, a PhD at Colorado State, continued doing research in remote sensing, and that's where I developed the reflectance-based crop coefficient method, which is a method that is used now for many crops. At the time I was working with corn. And So that led me to a postdoc at Texas A&M, working with passive microwave remote sensing from satellite. This was a Navy instrument on an Air Force satellite. I was on the Cal-Val team for the Special Sensor Microwave Imager. So it was a whole new area of remote sensing for me, but very good experience. Then I got the job at Utah State to be assistant professor there, and that's where I continued doing remote sensing, but I wanted to get in the air and cover more area, and that's where I developed the USU airborne video radiometer system. This was in the early 90s, so there were no digital cameras back then. It was based around video cameras with interference filters to get the blue, the red, the green, and the near-infrared quote-unquote color, or part of the spectrum, from reflected sunlight. And so that ended up being a platform that I used for all my career at Utah State. The 25 years that I was there, we had numerous contracts, and not only monitoring agriculture, but a lot of natural resources monitoring, a lot of monitoring of rivers, geomorphology of rivers, riparian vegetation of rivers, for the species composition, for invasive species, and of course the evapotranspiration and the water use. So that's how it all came about, and how I got involved in remote sensing of agriculture and natural resources.
Great. Thank you. It's always a long, winding road to see where people end up. For our listeners that may not know, you're also a very talented musician. So here at the office, we have the pleasure of hearing Christopher play guitar sometimes, and you're in several bands, right?
One band, and I've played with a local band as well.
Yeah.
So. And there's a Christmas party coming up. It might be a surprise.
Yeah. Well, you are a man of many talents. So Christopher, what are some of the projects you're working on now? And how do they all fit together towards the Institute's mission of a water and food secure world?
We have several efforts going on. One is the Parallel 41 flux network of eddy covariance towers. Eddy covariance is a technology, a method of measuring evapotranspiration in real time. Well, it can be in real time. It is in real time now because Lycor, the local company, and our industry partners have developed a method of essentially having a computer on board doing all the calculations that are required with eddy covariance measurements, because these towers are measuring vertical wind velocity and water vapor and heat fluxes 10 times a second. Okay, and so that data has to be filtered and it has to be processed and corrected, and usually that takes time. And for a typical tower, that's done post-processing. Right after 2 or 3 weeks, a technician goes there, downloads the data, takes it back to the lab, does all the processing, runs all this software to do the corrections, and then produces the evapotranspiration, which for those that are listening that are not quite sure what that term means, it's a combination of the transpiration of the plants, or the vegetation, and the evaporation of water from the soil surface or from the canopy if it's wet, right? So in agriculture, it's an important parameter, especially in irrigated agriculture, because it's using the water that's stored in the soil from rainfall or irrigation, and we've got to replenish that through the irrigation process. So keeping track of how much water is being used by the plants is an important process for irrigation water management. So going back to the Parallel 41, we've developed a network of these towers spread out between Iowa all the way to western Nebraska. So this is a big transition of precipitation. Nebraska is in a transition from the rain-fed agriculture of the east to the irrigated in the west, where it's semi-arid. So we have this wide range of precipitation, and therefore the crops need different amounts of irrigation in this transition, right? So growing corn in western Nebraska takes more water than in eastern Nebraska because it's drier and there's less rainfall. So our idea is to measure the ET of the corn and soybean crops along this gradient of precip and serve this data in real time now that Lycor has developed this computer on board that's doing all these corrections in real time through cell phone modem and a software they call FluxSuite. We are able from our desk to look at the data being calculated every 30 minutes and in real time see the data coming in. And the nice thing about it is that you can set quality control flags to warn you if there's a problem with the data. Like, oops, a bird pooped on the net radiometer, we got to go and clean it. It'll flag you, you'll get a warning, and then you can send someone out there to clean or correct the problem.
Who gets that job?
What's that?
Who gets that job?
Oh, a technician with a squirt gun. We've used squirt guns if the net radiometer, but typically we have a ladder and we go up there and carefully clean the domes. Sometimes what we do to avoid that is we put plastic owls on the tower itself so birds think, oh, there's an owl there, I'm not going to go there, right? It's our way of minimizing the bird damage, right? But back to the measurements then, we can get this data in real time, and it's really helpful to be able to do that. Now, the other project that's related to this is our GLODEC, Global Daily ET, evapotranspiration project. Here we're partnering with Martha Anderson from USDA in Beltsville, Chris Hain from NASA, and folks from University of Maryland, Mitch Scholl and Yun Yang. And we're running Martha's Alexi model using satellite data from a new satellite. Well, it's not so much new now. It's the VERS satellite from NOAA. It was launched in late 2012. And we got funding from USAID to develop this product in the Middle East, North Africa region. And so basically we're estimating the daily evapotranspiration from satellite imagery at a coarse resolution at 375 meters, but on a daily basis, right? Because this satellite is on a polar orbit, so it comes over twice a day, early afternoon and then after midnight. And with this data, we can then estimate how much the evapotranspiration of the surface is through the Alexi model. And in that project, we also developed a Python open source version of the DisAlexi, the disaggregation of the Alexi model, which uses Landsat satellite imagery, which now is at 30-meter resolution or 100 feet. Right, so now you have many, many pixels in a typical pivot size field, right? A lot more detail. And we can then downscale that ET to a daily value at 30 meters, right? And this product is what we want to bring. We're estimating it over the Central Plains and the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer. But what we want to do now is, now that we have the evapotranspiration being measured with the towers, okay, on a point basis in different fields, but we have this spatial product being generated everywhere, is to tie the two together, increase the accuracy of the spatial product with the tower data, and then serve the spatial product out to the farmers and water users, right? So they can go online with a tool and look at their field and see what the evapotranspiration over the last 7 days was, for example, and take a decision on how much they need to apply. And also identify if there's stresses in their fields or a sprinkler nozzle got plugged and they didn't notice and it shows up in the data. So that's our goal, bring these two projects together.
Can this spatial data be used only in the places where the parallel 41 flux towers exist, or can you expand
it? Can be where we want to do a global product. That's why it's called global. We have it running in Brazil because we have a project there now, and it's run on 15 degree by 15 degree latitude, longitude boxes, let's say. So we can turn it on anywhere in the world, and we've turned it on when we have funding, right? So in Brazil, we're partnering with universities down there with some funding from the couple of Brazilian government agencies. In the Middle East, North Africa, I explained the USAID funding. And then here in the Central Plains, we have funding from the Department of Energy and the USDA, and we're running it for those two projects. And that ties into a third project where we're measuring greenhouse gas being emitted by typical production fields that are supplying corn to the ethanol industry. So we've equipped eddy covariance towers with additional analyzers to measure, in addition to CO2 and water vapor, which are typically measured by eddy covariance. These additional analyzers measure methane and nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas that's emitted due to fertilizers. So now we've instrumented some of the towers with this additional equipment. That's another project that ties in.
You talked a little bit about how farmers might use this, but can you go into a little bit more detail about what exactly that means practically for a farmer that's using this evapotranspiration data and how they might talk about it instead of in these scientific terms?
Yeah, I think a lot of farmers already do irrigation scheduling through different methods. Either they go and they know their field well and they know the soils and they do the field method and feel how much water is in the soil. And with knowledge from previous years, they decide when it's time to irrigate. Some have sensors, soil water content sensors in the field, in certain areas of the field, and they use that data to decide. Some are using water balance, crop coefficients, and evapotranspiration to estimate the ET and figure out how much water that crop is using at that point in time of the growing season, and decide when they have to turn their pivot on again to avoid stress. And then other farmers are not doing any of this. They're irrigating because that's the way their father or grandfather were doing it. And so it's a range. And what we want to do is work with farmers to teach them how to use this product, right? I think if we can get farmers saving 1 or 2 inches a season, that's a savings in energy, right? And in water, right? If they don't pump out of the aquifer, it stays there. That's our goal, is to have an impact on the ground. Once we have all this working through working with the NRDs, right? The Natural Resources Districts here in Nebraska, to teach the farmers, show the product, and show them how to use it. In fact, you've heard of the DAWN project, right? The dashboard for agricultural water and nutrient management that's funded by USDA. Our SETME model, our spatial ET modeling interface that we use to, and already working with farmers to program and irrigate their fields on a demonstration basis. That's being programmed up in the dawn, and so it's going to be available to all farmers. And we hope then with the remote sensing and this product that we can get farmers to use and do a better job irrigating and applying nitrogen. That's the other part of the project, right?
Yeah. Well, and what a win for them, too, if they're using less water. That's less money from their pocket, which is always a good motivation, too.
Yes, and that's, I think you've touched on an important aspect. In the past, farmers would produce for maximum yield. Energy was cheap, water was available in the aquifer, fertilizer was cheap, so they were just putting everything on for maximum yield. Well, I think we need to change that mindset, right? Because maximum yield doesn't necessarily mean maximum profit, right? Because if you can optimize the use of all the resources, apply fertilizer only when it's needed, not over-irrigate and avoid leaching some of that fertilizer out below the root zone and causing problems for the aquifer and losing money because you're leaching fertilizer away and saving on energy, right? And maybe you'll get 20 bushels per acre less, but you're going to make more money in the bottom line, right? And this is going to be particularly important in the future for the carbon markets. That's coming down the pipeline, because that will be another source of revenue for farmers if they implement production systems that are going to store more carbon and emit less nitrous oxide. They'll get credits for that, right? And that's going to be part of the bottom line, along with water and fertilizer savings and energy.
So I can really see how all your projects kind of fit together towards this bigger picture. And it's also interesting that you're looking forward to these other things that are coming down the pipeline, and how all this data that we have can be a benefit there too. So having grown up in Brazil and spent your early career in Colorado, what do you see as some of the benefits to now doing research in the state of Nebraska?
In Colorado is when I started in irrigation, but it was at Utah State, which when I joined 30-odd years ago, was one of the premier departments of teaching irrigation engineering in the world. And so I had the opportunity of working with some of the big names in irrigation that were my colleagues there. And then, getting to know and teaching and students from all over the world that came to study at Utah State. And so, having started in Colorado and in Utah in the Colorado River Basin, which of course you've probably heard is undergoing a historic drought right now, and working with surface irrigation and systems there, and also having worked in southern Idaho with potato farmers that are using center pivots, coming to Nebraska now is plateful. Nebraska is the number one irrigated state in the U.S., right, in terms of area. And it's, for me as an irrigation engineer, I'm in a great playground. I'm having fun, learning new things. And the tie-in with Brazil is that Brazilian agriculture is growing. The irrigated area in Brazil is growing at a rate of, now it's about 250,000 hectares a year, of which almost 70% of that is center pivot irrigation. So the Nebraska companies are down there. Valmont and Lindsay have factories down there, and the other companies also sell. And so a lot of the crops that these systems are irrigating are similar. Like recently we received that delegation from Mato Grosso, if you remember, with the secretaries of state. Mato Grosso is beef, corn, and soybean, right? Sounds familiar?
Something we know well.
Yeah, we know about that. And so there's a lot of benefits and overlaps, and all the companies that are doing business here are doing business there. All the fertilizer, the seed companies, they're all, it's the same group of companies, right? So what we learn here with center pivot irrigation and the lessons that Nebraska has learned on problems from the past, like over irrigating and leaching of nitrates, that could be avoided in Brazil if we can teach them and say, already to avoid those problems, right, as they develop their irrigation industry. And so we hoped with the state of Mato Grosso to help them develop irrigated agriculture sustainably. So that means examining their surface and groundwater resources, looking at the recharge, seeing what can be sustainably extracted. And for the state, they are interested in intensifying their existing area, right? They already get 2 crops a year. with irrigation, they can get a third crop, a short season crop like dry beans, for example, in addition to the corn and soybeans. And that takes the pressure off expanding areas into the Amazon or into the savannas, right? So that's the interest of the state government, is to use irrigation as a way to also intensify, to avoid expanding into the ecosystems that are supposed to be protected.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to our mission too of bringing the knowledge of Nebraska and what we've done right and what we've done wrong to other areas of the world, and then taking knowledge from around the world and bringing it back to Nebraska. So
yes.
that's one very clear example of that mission. So,
and of course, having grown up in Brazil, I speak the language. Being able to contribute something down there as well, I have a good feeling about that, right?
Yeah.
And I think Brazil could be a very good partner for the U.S. in many aspects, right?
Well, in all your decades of work in remote sensing and evapotranspiration, what are some of the biggest successes that you've seen in producers, researchers, and policymakers working together to solve some of these big problems that you've already discussed? What are those good stories?
I think Nebraska is a good story to tell. And I think that's a story that I enjoy when I go overseas telling, the successful use of groundwater and the governance structure that was put in place with the natural resource district system and local control and farmers deciding how to use their water sustainably through the NRDs. I think that's a great success story. And it sets up Nebraska to deal with climate extremes, right? It's just a matter of time that drought that's been hanging over the western U.S. moves into the Central Plains. In fact, this was a drought year. We don't know if it's going to last. We'll find out this winter and spring. But the good news is, even if we go into a multi-year drought here, at least we have the governance structure in place to be able to, control pumping and ratchet things down a little to preserve the aquifer for future production. So I think this is a good story to tell, and I hope that some of the projects that the Institute is working on are going to have, some are having impact, and they're going to have a bigger impact in the future. If we can get 50,000 wells in Nebraska to pump an inch less or 2 inches less, that's significant. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we can contribute towards that with our research and education efforts.
I want to shift gears a little bit now. Since it was initiated in 2014, our student support program, we've made awards of more than $3.6 million in the form of 96 awards to our faculty fellows that are supporting postdoctoral, graduate, and undergraduate students on all 4 University of Nebraska campuses. In your role at DWFI, you also oversee this supported student program. What excites you the most about these next generation of leaders that we're training in water and food security?
I think that's going to be another impact story for the Institute, right? As these young professionals go into the workforce, right? They'll hopefully remember their funding from the Dougherty Water for Food Global Institute and the education they got, and they'll have an impact. I mean, these are the future generations that are going to deal with climate extremes and producing food with less water. So hopefully we're going to contribute towards adaptation and future success in this realm.
Having spent some time with our supported students, it's always fun to see the wheels turning when they're thinking about problems and coming up with these solutions that I never would have in a million years dreamed about. And there's nothing stopping them. I think they are very set on solving that problem in whatever way that they can. So I think they're an inspiration to me, and I think that's just one of the many great things that the Institute provides is that student support money.
Yeah, I think it's been a very successful program, and while we have the funding, we'll continue to do it. Every year we get a new cadre of applications. Some years we don't have enough money to fund everyone, right? But typically we anywhere from 8 to 10 students a year, both masters and PhD students, and so the masters typically get funded for 2 years and the PhDs for 3. Typically we have like 30 students being funded, right, because they're in different points of their studies, right? And then we add 8 to 10 new ones every year, and at the tail end they graduated and drop off on the other side with their degrees, right, and go into the workforce.
So I want to know why you touched on this a little bit, but why you decided to join the Institute back in 2013. Why you made the shift from Utah State to the Institute when it was relatively new back then, and what are some of the most important things that you think the Institute brings to the international table?
Okay, that's a good, very good question, because at the time I was a successful full professor at Utah State, lots of funding. I had that research aircraft, so there was always work to do. But when I got approached for the job, I was really intrigued, right? Here was a new institute starting up with a noble mission of water and food security, wanting to do international work, which I like doing. I was involved in many projects at Utah State University. We were very proactive in the international scene. And so here was an opportunity to help be part of building the Institute with a noble mission, and at the right time of my career. I just thought, wow, if I don't take this job, I'll regret it later, right? So, on the other hand, these moves can be taxing and difficult, right? Because you're established. Mm-hmm. I spent 25 years in Logan, Utah. We had friends. I like downhill skiing and mountain biking, and now I'm going to live in the plains, right? So there's all these personal, family, and other things that factor in, but we have no regrets. Professionally and for the family, it was a great move, and I'm glad to be here and still helping grow this pie.
We're glad you're here, too. So is there anything else that you'd like to add that we missed talking about today?
Well, I think the Institute has still a bright future, because we are working in a space that is important, right? You can't grow food without water. We need water to live, and not only to grow food. And so with climate change and climate extremes, managing water for these multiple uses that society need, right? Industrial, agricultural, urban uses, hydropower, ecological, all these is going to be a challenge, right? So the Institute, if it can contribute by educating and by doing research and policy and scientific research, we have a place to continue contributing to the world and the society.
Well, that is all I have for us today, Christopher. Thank you so much for your time today, and I really enjoyed learning more about your important work. Even though I've talked to you many times about all these subjects, I always learn a little bit extra. So thanks for all you do towards a more water and food secure world, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you, Francis, for having me on the podcast.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.